Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. This is the Springathon poetry tag that was created a solid 5-6 weeks ago by Roz over at Scally Dandling about the books. I was then tagged easily 4 weeks plus ago by Alan over at the Book Traveler. I love poetry. I wanted to do this. I kept kind of putting it off. I actually ran out of pages in the little notebook I was using to keep track of things, and I was like, I got to get this done. And I knew I was going to be reading a poetic work, so I wanted to pay attention to that and see if that affected any of my responses to this. Let's jump in. This is sort of the last Tag Tuesday on which I could do this, although because spring ends this Sunday. Although it's quite hot here. It feels like summer, though the flowers are still blooming. So here we go. Prompt 1 is about a bird. Roz suggested The Thrush's Nest by John Clare. John Clare is a great English pastoral poet. Interesting guy overall, but I was most familiar with his work, The Badger. In The Thrush's Nest, there are a couple of phrases. He writes these great, almost elegiac pastoral lyrics. There's rhyme, but he includes these phrases or images that just seem human or inhuman, like in a strange way. So he has a phrase, drank the sound. He has another one, warped the moss. The bird is warping the moss. And this idea of like constantly like the beauty of nature, but then nature warping itself, not just humans warping nature, but nature warping itself. And the laughing sky. My selection would be the end of Alcyone and Ceÿx from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So Alcyone was going to travel to ask an oracle for some information. His wife had a bad dream. He ended up shipwrecked and drowned, and it's a very like moving passage where he's sort of the last survivor, trying to stay afloat, thinking of his wife as he dies. And so then the gods have a dream, pretend to be Ceÿx to tell his wife Alcyone that he has died. And so she goes down, and she's standing on the beach, and his body ends up washing up. Beloved Ceÿx, she cried, poor soul, did you need to return to your wife like this? On the water's edge was a mole, constructed to break the ocean's initial fury, and weaken the force of the tide before it arrived on the beach. Alcyone leapt on the groin, an astonishing feat. She was suddenly flying on newfound wings through the air, and skimming the ocean, turned to a sorrowing bird. In the course of her flight, she emitted a querulous, dirge-like croaking noise from her slender beak. As soon as she reached the silent and bloodless body, she folded her new wings round the limbs of her loved one and vainly attempted to kiss his lips. The bill was too hard and the kisses were cold. People wondered if Ceÿx felt them or merely appeared to raise his head as it tossed on the waves, but he certainly felt them. At last the gods took pity, and both were changed into birds. Now that they'd suffered the selfsame fate, their love could continue. Even today, in their life as birds, their marriage is never dissolved. They are free to mate and produce their young. And so it's a sad episode from the Metamorphoses that then turns into a beautiful one. Prompt 2 about water, Roz suggested a short story of Falling by Alice Oswald. There are a couple rhyming couplets, and then there's a cool piece where it's an elliptical poem where the first and last like pair essentially repeats the final syllables. So you know. Story of the falling rain, and fall again. And so that's always kind of cool. My selection is Stars and Moon on the Yang-tse by Tu Fu, a Chinese poet. Here we go. After sudden rain, a clear autumn night, on golden waves the sparkle of the jeweled cord, the river of heaven white from eternity, the Yang-tse shallows limpid since just now, reflections, pearls from a snapped string. High in the sky one mirror rises. Afterlight which fades as the clock drips, still fainter as the dewdrops settle on the flowers. And I just love the idea of how the water and the beauty just exists in so many different ways. And then the mirror-like nature of water is something I've always enjoyed here. Prompt 3, animal. So something about an animal. Roz selected The Trout by Seamus Heaney. And so that's interesting. It's that was one of the more that's a more modern poem, of course, 20th century. but it has it's unrhymed, and there's a great deal of like violence throughout it, like the violence of the trout's existence, but it's just the violence of nature as well. I think we often think of the violence of humans in environmental destruction, or in the destruction of animals or habitats, but there's a destruction that exists within nature. My selection, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but my selection would be Tortoise Shout by D.H. Lawrence. This is a weird poem. T.H. Lawrence was a weird dude. But Tortoise Shout, he goes into the consciousness of a turtle, and he then pictures the turtle's desire to mate. And what would it be like when turtles fall in love and are like, and fall in lust almost, and are like just like overcome with passion for each other. That sounds weird. The poem itself is quite weird. I thought he was dumb. I said he was dumb. Yet I've heard him cry. From first faint scream out of life's unfathomable dawn, far off, so far, like a madness under the horizon's dawning rim, far, far off, far scream, tortoise in extremis. Why were we crucified into sex? Why were we not left rounded off and finished in ourselves as we began, as he certainly began, so perfectly alone? Afar, was it audible scream, or did it sound on the plasm direct? Worse than the cry of the newborn. A scream, a yell, a shout, a paean, a death agony, a birth cry, a submission, all tiny, tiny, far away, reptile under the first dawn. War cry, triumph, acute delight, death scream reptilian. Why was the veil torn? The silken shriek of the soul's torn membrane, the male soul's membrane, torn with a shriek, half music, half horror. Crucifixion, male tortoise, cleaving behind the hovel wall of that dense female, mounted and tense, spread eagle, outreaching out of the shell in tortoise nakedness. Long neck and long, vulnerable limbs extruded, spread eagle over her house roof, and the deep secret. And it goes on. He talks, remembering about other animals crying, a frog, goose, nightingales, a rabbit, and he lists all of these, and running away from the sound of a woman in labor, something like an owl wooing, and listening inwardly to the first bleat of a lamb, the first wail of an infant, and my mother singing to herself. And so he continues, and more than all these, and less than all these, this last strange, faint Coitian yell of the male tortoise at extremity, tiny from under the very edge of the farthest far-off horizon of life, the cross, the wheel on which our silence first is broken, sex which breaks up our integrity, our single inviolability, our deep silence, tearing a cry from us, torn to become whole again after long seeking for what is lost. The same cry from the tortoise as from Christ, the Osiris cry of abandonment, that which is whole torn asunder, that which is in part finding its whole again throughout the universe. That poem haunts me, and it is, again, weird, but it just shows that when we try to actually understand the mind of an animal, or equally strange when we try to understand the mind of a tree, not the mind, but the existence of a tree, or the just the essence of water, a body of water, or a mountain, how strange that can be. So prompt 4, this is the toughest one for me, so many good choices. Daisies by Kathleen Jamie, which is a really weird poem. It imputes existentialism to daisies in my reading. Die we will, innocent or no, and then at the very end, die never knowing what we miss. That was, again, putting anthropomorphization onto plants or bodies of water or mountains is always very strange. So my selection will be a poet from the Harlem Renaissance, Angelina Weld Grimke. Very interesting. Her father was the second African American to graduate from Harvard. Her paternal grandmother had been a slave, and her paternal grandfather was the slave owner, who, after the slave had been freed and he was a widower, ended up marrying his former slave and having a couple of children. Again, strange. But she went to Wellesley College and worked for a long time at the Dunbar School in Washington, D.C., which was a major African-American high school. So this is Grass Fingers. Touch me, little cool grass fingers, elusive, delicate grass fingers. With your shy brushings, touch my face, my naked arms, my thighs, my feet. Is there nothing that is kind? You need not fear me. Soon I shall be too far beneath you for you to reach me, even with your tiny, timorous toes. And again, just such a strange idea of the being caressed by grass, and this sense of there's a quiet sense of passion there in that poem that I really like. Prompt 5, travel or destination. Roz had suggested A Day in Sussex by Wilfred Scowen. I really liked that poem. That was probably my favorite of the 5 that I read from there. There's a great deal of like a character who wants to find, the poet wants to find solace in nature, which I think many of us do, especially with the feeling cloistered and shut in throughout the pandemic. Being able to go outside safely and experience nature has been something I think a lot of people have yearned to do and have enjoyed being able to do. It was a very lyrical poem as well. My selection will be Reconnaissance by Arne Bontemps, another Harlem Renaissance poet. And I like the imagery in this one. After the cloud of embankments, the lamentation of wind, and the starry descent into time, we came to the flashing waters and shaded our eyes from the glare, alone with the shore and the harbor, the stems of the coconut trees, the fronds of silence and hushed music. We cried for the new revelation and waited for miracles to rise. Where elements touch and merge, where shadows swoon like outcasts on the sand, and the tried moment waits, its courage gone, there were we, in latitude, where storms are born. So the general challenge was to read a work of nature writing, of nonfiction nature writing, but poetry can be nonfiction. I'll pull out Withered Tree by Han Yu, also a Chinese poet. Not a twig or a leaf on the old tree. Wind and frost harm it no more. A man could pass through the hole in its belly. Ants crawl searching under its peeling bark. Its only lodger, the toadstool which dies in a morning. The birds no longer visit in the twilight. But its wood can still spark tinder. It does not care yet to be only the void at its heart. So that ends it. Tag booktubers who love poetry. Well, honestly, it's late in spring. If you haven't heard of this or done this yet and you would like to, by all means, you're tagged. And best everyone, thank you.